By the third day trapped at that line shack, I'd stopped counting the hours by the clock on the shelf, which had stopped itself sometime during the first night's cold, and started counting them instead by which of the two men in that cramped room I trusted more with a choice I hadn't expected to be asked to make. I did not know, boarding the last stage of the season out of Cheyenne, that the storm closing in behind us would strand me 3 days with a lawman who'd lost his prisoner somewhere, in the white and a station keeper who'd said perhaps 40 words total by the time I understood. I was in danger of losing my heart to a stranger before I ever learned his full name. My sister Ruth was expecting her first child any day in the mining camp at Silver Fork, 110 miles further into the mountains than the stage line even ran regular, and I had promised her, in a letter sent back in September, that I would be there for it whatever the weather did, because our own mother had died delivering Ruth's youngest brother with nobody but a frightened neighbor woman to help her. And Ruth had asked for exactly one thing from me in this life, which was simply not to be alone the way our mother had been. I still remembered, though I'd been barely 9 years old at the time, standing outside our own bedroom door, listening to that neighbor woman's voice rise and fall through the wall for the better part of a night, understanding only that something was badly wrong and that nobody had thought to explain it to a child too young to be useful. Ruth had been just shy of 13 then, old enough to understand considerably more of what she'd overheard through that same door, and she had carried the particular fear of it, I knew, into every year since, certain in some private, unexamined way that childbirth itself was simply a thing women survived only when somebody who loved them stood close enough to notice if they didn't. The stage company's agent in Cheyenne had told me plainly, selling me my ticket, that this coach was the last one scheduled through Sweetwater Pass before the company closed the route for winter, and that if I missed it, I would not see Silver Fork again until the thaw, however far along Ruth's time had gotten by then. The storm came up faster than the driver had judged it would, a wall of white swallowing the road within an hour of the first flakes, and by early afternoon he'd turned the team off the main route toward a line shack he knew stood somewhere along the ridge, driving half-blind through snow already deep enough to slow the horses to a crawl. He shouted back to me twice during that last hour, more to hear his own voice over the wind than to tell me anything I could use. Once to say he'd driven this pass 11 seasons and never once seen it close this fast, and once, considerably more grimly, to tell me to hold tight to the seat rail and not to worry if the coach tipped, because tipped was still better than what the drop on the far side of the road would do to us if he misjudged the edge in this white. I held that rail with both hands until my knuckles ached, praying in the plain, wordless way a person prays when there isn't time to form actual sentences, and I remember thinking absurdly of Ruth's letter folded in my coat pocket, as though the paper itself might somehow anchor me to the promise I'd made her. We reached the shack with the light nearly gone, and the wind screaming loud enough that the driver had to shout for me to keep close behind him. And it was the shack's keeper who came out into that howling white to help us the last 100 yards. A broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat who took my arm without ceremony and half-carried me the final stretch through drifts already past my knees. His name was Wyatt Calloway, and he had kept that particular line shack for the stage company 3 years, a job that suited him, he told me later, because it asked nothing of a man except reliability and a willingness to be alone with his own thoughts for months at a stretch, both of which he'd apparently had in generous supply since arriving in the territory. He was dark-haired and sun-weathered even in winter. With the particular economy of movement, I'd later come to associate with men who'd spent considerable time learning that wasted motion in a hard climate could cost a person dearly, and that first evening he said perhaps a dozen words total. Mostly instructions about where to hang wet things and which corner of the single room held the driest firewood. I noticed, that first hour, the way he moved through the small space without once bumping a shelf or a hanging pot despite the dim light. The particular certainty of a man who had memorized every inch of a room, the way some men memorize a face. And I noticed too the deliberate care he took setting a second and then a third bowl of stew within easy reach of the driver and myself before he ever sat down to his own, as though hospitality towards strangers was simply a fact of the job he'd never once thought to question, storm or no storm. The shack itself was a single sturdy room built low against the mountain wind, a stone hearth at one end, a narrow sleeping loft above. Provisions stacked along one wall for exactly this kind of emergency. The stage company understood better than most that a keeper isolated on a mountain pass through a Rocky Mountain winter needed enough flour and salt pork and coal oil to outlast whatever the season threw at him, sometimes for weeks at a stretch if a storm sealed the pass entirely. The company paid its line keepers modestly, Wyatt told me. $30 a month plus the provisions and a small bonus. Each spring, a man managed to bring his section of road through winter without losing a horse or a traveler, which he said with the dry, particular humor of someone who understood exactly how low a bar that bonus represented some years and how nearly impossible a bar it represented others. A ledger hung on a nail by the door, required by the company, in which Wyatt was meant to record every stage that passed, every delay, every traveler sheltered, and he added our names to it that first evening with the same unhurried care he brought to banking the fire, as though the keeping of small, honest records mattered to him considerably more than the isolation of the job that required it. Wyatt built up the fire until the single room had gone properly warm, and the driver, once he'd seen to the horses in the shack's small attached stable, settled into a corner, with the particular exhausted stillness of a man who intended to sleep through anything short of the roof coming down. It was near midnight when the second stranger reached us. A sound at the door that had Wyatt on his feet with a rifle before I'd even fully registered it as knocking rather than wind. And the man who half fell through the door when Wyatt opened it was younger than Wyatt, sandy-haired beneath a snow-crusted hat. One arm held stiff against his ribs in a way that spoke of injury rather than cold alone. He collapsed more than sat once Wyatt got him near the fire, snow melting off him in a widening dark patch on the packed earth floor, and for a long moment he seemed unable to do anything but breathe, each inhale visibly costing him something around the ribs. I brought him water before he'd said a single word, and he drank it with shaking hands, and only once the shaking had eased somewhat did he manage to speak in full sentences at all. He identified himself. Once he'd gotten enough breath back to speak properly, as Daniel Calloway, a deputy United States Marshal escorting a prisoner named Jed Harlan to stand trial at the county seat for a string of robberies along the rail line, and he told the rest of it in pieces between labored breaths. The wagon overturning on a blind curve when the storm hit hardest. Harlan slipping his bindings in the chaos and vanishing into the whiteout before Daniel. Injured in the fall himself, could do anything to stop him. Chased him near a mile on foot before my own legs gave out under me, he said, and I wanted understood plainly that losing him wasn't for lack of trying. I'd have chased him clean off this mountain if the mountain had let me. I want to tell you plainly that the next several hours were among the most frightening of my life. Because a lawman losing a dangerous prisoner in a blizzard is one kind of trouble, and that same prisoner potentially still alive and armed somewhere on the same mountain as the shelter you're sitting in is an entirely different and considerably worse kind. Wyatt barred the door and the shuttered window with a calm, methodical thoroughness that told me this was not the first time he'd prepared that particular room against a threat. And Daniel, once his ribs were bound and his color had returned enough to think clearly, insisted on taking the first watch himself despite an injury that should rightly have put him straight to bed. Man's desperate enough to run off half-frozen into open country rather than face a judge, Daniel said. He's desperate enough to come looking for shelter wherever he thinks he'll find it. I'd rather be the one awake when he tries the door than leave that particular welcome to chance. The first night passed without incident beyond the wind, though none of us slept well, and by morning the storm had settled into the kind of steady, relentless snowfall that promised days rather than hours before the pass would be passable again. Wyatt rationed the firewood and provisions with the careful arithmetic of a man who'd clearly done this math before, and I found myself, that first full day, falling into an easy working rhythm alongside him, melting snow for water, keeping the fire fed, mending the tear in Daniel's coat sleeve while Wyatt showed me, without being asked, how to properly bank coals to hold heat through the coldest hours of night. The stage driver, a weathered man named Osric, who'd said barely a dozen words since our arrival, occupied himself mending harness leather in the corner and offering, every so often, some small piece of mountain wisdom nobody had asked for, but everybody appreciated regardless, which drifts to avoid come the thaw, which of Wyatt's stored provisions kept longest. The particular way a man could tell real morning from a false lightening of the storm's gray by watching how the smoke off the chimney bent. Daniel spent that first full day mostly resting his ribs at Wyatt's insistence, though I caught him twice at the shuttered window, peering through the gap at the edge of the boards toward the white nothing outside, as though sheer vigilance alone might undo the previous night's failure. I brought him broth around midday and sat with him a while, and he thanked me with a formality that hadn't yet cracked into anything more familiar, though I noticed him watching my hands as I worked rather than my face. The particular attention of a man cataloging small competent things about a person he was still deciding how to feel about. He told me, that second evening, a little of why he'd taken a job that asked a man to be alone with a mountain for months at a stretch. He'd ridden with a cattle outfit down in Texas some years back, he said, and lost 2 men from his own crew to a blizzard not unlike this one. Caught out on open range with no shelter close enough to reach. And he'd carried the particular weight of having survived that same storm himself, in a gully he'd found by nothing but luck, for longer than he cared to examine directly. He described haltingly the specific detail that had stayed with him longest, that one of the 2 men, a boy barely 18 named Cody, had been close enough to hear calling in the last hour before the wind swallowed every other sound, and that Wyatt had not been able to determine, then or since, which direction the calling had actually come from, or whether moving toward it might have saved the boy, or simply added a third body to the 2, the outfit eventually recovered, come the thaw. Spent a long while after that, he said, unable to sit still in any room that had walls I couldn't see past. Took this job because it gave me walls I understood completely, and enough warning of weather to make sure nobody within my reach ever had to wonder, calling into wind, whether the man who could have found them was even listening. Man who takes this job, he said, isn't running from people so much as making certain every single winter after that one that nobody freezes to death within reach of a door he could have opened for them. I understood. Hearing that, considerably more about the careful, methodical way he'd barred that same door against Daniel's prisoner than any direct explanation could have given me. Daniel, for his part, spent that second day in a low simmer of guilt he tried and mostly failed to keep off his face, blaming himself for the overturned wagon, for Harlan's escape, for the injury that had slowed his pursuit long enough to lose the man's trail in the whiteout entirely. He told me that afternoon a little of his own history in the work, 3 years a deputy marshal after 2 years before that riding for a ranch that had gone under in a bad market, and a single previous prisoner years back who had escaped his custody under considerably less forgivable circumstances than a blizzard, a lapse in attention rather than an act of nature that had cost a rancher 2 counties over his life before Daniel finally ran the man down again. He did not excuse Harlan's escape by comparison. If anything, he seemed to hold this failure to a harder standard precisely because of the earlier one, as though a man who had already learned this particular lesson once had no right to the mercy of learning it gently a second time. He was younger than Wyatt by some years, careful and precise in his speech even through pain, and I caught him watching me once or twice that second day, with an attention I understood well enough to recognize, though he never once acted on it beyond the watching, professional restraint holding him back the same way it seemed to hold most things about him back. I did not encourage it, not out of unkindness, but because I had already noticed, by that second evening, exactly where my own attention kept drifting whenever Wyatt crossed the small room, and I did not think it fair to either man to pretend otherwise to myself. It was on that second evening, banking the fire together after Daniel had finally been persuaded to rest his injured ribs in the loft, that Wyatt and I found ourselves sitting close by the hearth with nothing much left to do but wait out the wind, and I asked him, plainly, whether 3 years alone on that mountain had been worth whatever peace he'd been chasing when he took the job. He considered the question a long while before answering, the particular stillness I'd already come to recognize as him choosing his words with care rather than searching for them. Thought I wanted quiet, he said. Turns out quiet's only worth wanting until somebody worth talking to shows up at your door in a blizzard. And then a man starts noticing how much of his own peace was really just loneliness wearing a more respectable coat. He had gotten that far, and I had leaned in enough to hear the rest of it over the wind, when Daniel's voice carried down sharp from the loft asking whether either of us had heard something moving near the stable. And whatever Wyatt had been building toward folded itself back into the ordinary business of checking a bolted door. The something turned out to be real. We found the stable's side door forced half open the next morning. Snow drifted in across the floor in a pattern that told an experienced eye exactly how long ago somebody had come and gone, and one of the two horses missing entirely. Cut loose and either stolen or simply run off in panic during whatever had happened in the night. Wyatt crouched a long while over the churned snow near the doorway, reading it the way another man might read a printed page, and told us grim that whoever had been there had stood close enough to the wall for some time before leaving. Long enough that the drift beneath the eave had been packed nearly solid by a man standing still rather than passing through, which meant Harlan had been watching the shack itself, weighing whether to try the main door, before some fear or some remaining scrap of caution had sent him for the horse instead. Daniel's face went white with something considerably worse than his injury when he saw it, understanding immediately that Harlan had been close enough, at some point in those dark hours, to reach the very building we were sheltering in, and that none of us, absorbed in our own conversation by the fire, had heard a thing beyond the wind. We spent that third day in a state of careful vigilance that frayed all our nerves thinner than the storm itself had managed. Daniel insisting on standing watch despite ribs that clearly pained him with every movement. Wyatt checking and rechecking the bar across the door with a thoroughness that had less to do with doubting his own work and more to do with needing something to occupy his hands. Osric the driver took to pacing the small room's perimeter every hour or so, muttering under his breath about should-have-beens regarding the missing horse, and I found myself unable to sit still either, mending the same seam on my traveling coat 3 separate times simply to have something in my hands that wasn't shaking. Conversation, when it happened at all that day, came in short, clipped bursts entirely unlike the easier talk of the evening before, each of us listening past our own sentences for any sound beyond the ordinary wind. It was past midday when we heard it plainly this time, a fumbling at the shuttered window rather than the door, and Daniel was moving before either Wyatt or I had fully registered the sound, positioning himself with his revolver drawn despite the pain it clearly cost him to raise his arm that high, calling out Harlan's name into the wind with an authority that didn't waver, even though his hand, I noticed, did. Harlan came through the window rather than surrendering, snow-blind and half-frozen and desperate enough that reason had apparently stopped mattering to him somewhere in the previous 36 hours. Glass and splintered shutters scattering across the floor in a violence that seemed to happen all at once, and also, somehow, slow enough for me to register every separate piece of it. The scramble that followed happened too fast for me to describe it now with any real order. Daniel taking a wild blow to his already injured ribs that dropped him hard against the hearthstones, the breath going out of him in a sound I still hear some nights. Wyatt closing the distance in 2 strides and taking Harlan down bodily before the man could reach the weapon he'd apparently been carrying. The two of them grappling across the packed earth floor in a tangle of limbs and grunted effort that knocked the water bucket over and sent it rolling loud against the wall. And myself, without entirely deciding to, snatching the fallen revolver off the floor and leveling it at a stranger for the first time in my life, hands shaking so badly I doubted I could have hit the wall behind him, let alone the man himself, though the sight of it, pointed steady enough in the dim light, was apparently sufficient to end whatever fight remained in him, Harlan going suddenly and completely still beneath Wyatt's weight the moment he understood the odds in that room had shifted decisively against him. We had Harlan bound and secured well before the light failed that evening, Daniel managing the restraints himself, despite ribs that had to be paining him considerably worse after the fall, refusing help with a stubbornness I recognized by then as simple professional pride, reasserting itself after 2 days of feeling like he'd failed at the one job he'd been sent up that mountain to do. He thanked me, once Harlan was settled and quiet in the corner Wyatt had cleared for exactly this purpose, with a formality that couldn't quite hide how shaken the whole encounter had left him. "I have spent 3 days," he said, "watching a woman I'd started to hope might think well of me instead grow considerably fonder of a man who barely talks. I find I can't even resent it properly, given that the same man just put himself between me and a loaded gun without stopping. To weigh the arithmetic first, I told him I was sorry. for however my own feelings had complicated an already difficult few days, and he shook his head. The particular gesture of a man setting something down rather than continuing to carry it. "Don't apologize for it," he said. "A man ought to know the difference between the woman who saved his life with a shaking hand and the one he'd merely convinced himself, 3 days into a blizzard, he might have loved given enough time. I believe I'm looking at the same woman for both, which is a considerably more honest conclusion than I arrived here with." The pass cleared enough for travel on the 4th morning, the storm having finally spent itself sometime before dawn, and Daniel rode out first with Harlan bound behind him, eager, I think, to deliver the man to the county seat and put the whole difficult business properly behind him. Though he took my hand before mounting and told me, plain and without bitterness, that he hoped whatever I found with Wyatt was worth the particular cost of finding it during a blizzard rather than a proper courtship. I stood at the shack door and watched him ride down out of sight around the first bend, and I felt, watching him go, a genuine fondness for a man I would likely never see again, tangled up with a relief I didn't examine too closely at the time. Wyatt rode with me himself, the final stretch to Silver Fork once the stage company sent a fresh coach through 2 days later, refusing to let me make that last leg of the journey with strangers after everything the mountain had already put me through. And we reached my sister's cabin on a clear, cold afternoon to find Ruth's baby daughter already 11 days old and thriving, born, as it turned out, the very night the storm first closed the pass behind me. Ruth cried when she saw me, and cried harder when I introduced Wyatt and asked me, once we'd gotten a private moment together, exactly how a woman managed to fall in love with a near stranger in a snowbound line shack in the space of 3 days. And I told her honestly that I wasn't certain 3 days was really what it had taken, only that 3 days trapped together had simply been what it took for both of us to stop being too careful to say so. She held her daughter out to me then, small and sleeping and entirely unaware of how close her aunt had come to missing this particular introduction, and told me that our mother, wherever she was, had likely spent the whole of that storm watching the pass considerably more anxiously than either of us had, which struck me, hearing it, as exactly the kind of thing our mother would have said herself, had she lived long enough to say it. Wyatt gave up the line shack the following spring, unable, he said, to keep pretending the isolation was really about peace rather than simple avoidance, and took work instead breaking horses for a rancher outside Silver Fork close enough that I saw him most evenings rather than once a season. The stage company hired a new keeper for that stretch of pass, a quiet older man Wyatt spent 2 full weeks training before he'd trust the job to anyone else's hands, walking him through every provision shelf and every drift pattern with the same careful thoroughness he'd once shown me banking coals through a long, cold night. I think of that storm sometimes still. The particular fear of a fist at a shuttered window, and the particular warmth of a fire banked low between 2 people who had finally stopped talking about the mountain and started, carefully, talking about everything else. I did not choose Wyatt over Daniel so much as I finally stopped being too frightened of a blizzard to notice which fire I kept wanting to sit closest to.